I want to welcome to the show Sam Black. Sam, welcome.
Glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
I am so excited for our conversation today because it's something that I feel like is still a bit of a taboo topic, even though studies are showing that the predominant men and women are using pornography. It's still not something that is openly shared. And I think there's just a lot of bad information out there. And so I'm excited for our conversation today.
Well, I am excited too. Thank you for having me on.
Yeah. So I would like to start off with asking you, what is something that most people don't know about pornography's impact on the brain? Because some people think it's just like, oh, that's just something that you do. It's not that big of a deal. And I have a feeling you would say otherwise.
Yeah, and I think we need to really understand the impact on us for a lifetime. The uh, I think one of the things we need to really understand, first of all, is how people get stuck in the very first place. That, and I find three components to that, and that is early exposure,
Yeah.
and I think that's significant for us to about when we talk about how does pornography impact our brain, because when we think of why we try to protect children from pornography, there's a significant reason why. And likely many of the people who are listening right now were exposed at an early age, especially if they find themselves struggling now. And
Mm-hmm.
so let's talk a little bit about that, and that'll help us better understand ourselves in our present tense as adults, as well as understand why we also protect our kids from pornography.
Definitely.
So we're beautifully designed. Uh, God designed sex uh, in for marriage, and pornography is not sex. It's a hijacking of what God
Mm-hmm.
created. And so when we dive into our neurology, when we dive into our understanding our that's those stimulus of how pornography impacts our brain, we're not talking about something foreign. We're talking about something that truly is how we were created in the first place. It is often said that pornography can be is early exposure to pornography, I should say, is a formative foundational building block upon which other how we interact with pornography going forward in our life from childhood. It's also how we might think about sex. We might
Mm-hmm.
think about other people and relationships. So that early exposure is very impactful. Now we have to understand that that young brain is not yet equipped; it's not developed, and so that
Mm-hmm.
underdeveloped brain, which has a lot of of ability for emotions and learning, it the prefrontal cortex itself doesn't develop until the fully develop until our mid 20s or late 20s. So part of this is understanding that our brains are growing and they're building, and what you put into that brain has significant impact, and it actually builds neural pathways that help us live in our environment, learn, and grow.
Mm-hmm.
And that young brain also has more mirror neurons. That means mirror neurons is like when you see something, it feels like you're doing it. It's why you flinch when you
Mm-hmm.
see a batter get hit by a ball,
Mm-hmm.
or you see the runner cross the finish line and your heart races a little bit. Those are mirror neurons at work, but the young brain has many more, and that's why children learn so much more quickly.
Yeah, they're trying to model what they're seeing from their parents and what they're seeing at school. They soak it up like sponges. And so
That's right. And even that young brain has some basic uh, feelings and emotions that they may not understand when they see something like pornography. It may be very shocking because today's pornography is typically not just nudity, it's very debasing, often violent, degrading. And so when a child sees that, they may not have even the basic understandings of, of the mechanics of sex, And so they go from, I know nothing about sex, to seeing more than any child should ever see. And
Yeah.
so that, of course, ignites and releases some dopamine to the
Mhm.
brain, and dopamine helps you focus your attention to the point of tunnel vision. And in
Mm.
God's design for sex, the whole world is supposed to disappear as sexual cues are picked up and dopamine fires off, is released in the brain. Then you can focus on your spouse, and it becomes a beautiful thing for our attention, and you get a spritz of something that feels good,
Mhm.
and you become more and more focused. So for the young brain that's underdeveloped, without that decision-making prefrontal cortex to be able to look away, they see
Mhm.
something for the first time, because dopamine also loves novelty, something that's
Mhm.
not been seen before, done before, viewed
Mhm.
before. And so here is that young child, and they go from knowing nothing to seeing very inappropriate content online. They're 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 shocked by what they see.
Mhm.
They are, it is very intriguing. I first saw just nudity compared to what we see today.
Mhm.
Back when I was 10 years old, I saw
Mm.
nudity for the first time at 10 years old. I remember walking out of my home in Florida. My brother and his friend, who was 10 years older than me, they were leaning against this car looking at a magazine, and they were looking at it sideways, and that just didn't make any sense. And I said, "Hey, what are you
Mhm.
guys looking at?" And they turned it around and showed it to me. And
Mhm.
and though I grew up in a Christian home, uh, I did not step away. I stepped forward,
Mhm.
because every child is naturally curious about what the opposite sex looks like without
Mhm.
clothes. And so, um, his friend says, "Well, you don't want to miss the good part," and began folding out the rest of the magazine. But I had no understanding of the
Mhm.
basics of sex.
Mhm.
I had a friend, and his dad had pornography that was falling out of his closet. And
Mhm.
it looked a little like a waterfall. If you can imagine this shelf up top of the closet stacked with pornography, and it was kind of flowing over and falling on the floor. I could take anything I wanted, and I did. The third aspect of this is that though I came from a Christian home, it was hypocritically violent.
Mm.
And so, um, when I felt fear and frustration or anger, I could escape to pornography. And I didn't even realize I was doing that. It
Right.
just became part of my life. So that just helps paint a little bit of a picture
Yeah.
that we are not just our brains, we're this whole sphere. And that early exposure, though, you notice that I didn't look away, even though some part of me said, that's I shouldn't be seeing this. Like, if
Mhm.
my mom saw me watching this, she'd be upset with me,
Right.
right? And so, right in there, you get that roots of feelings of shame
Yeah.
about how it's impacting this. Now, you'll notice I told you a story about my first exposure.
Mhm.
And what I have found is that most men and women can tell you a story about the first time that they were exposed to pornography, because dopamine helps build those memories, emotional memories in our brain, along with chemicals like norepinephrine. And those help cement those stories in our brains. So most adults can tell you about the first time that they were exposed to pornography, even though they were young.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And I know for a lot of clients I work with that deal with issues of pornography, there's so much shame. But as we unpack to figure out like when they were first exposed, it's incredibly illuminating to them to understand that it's really not just because they want to look at it. There's really a pull to look at it. And I find the
Mhm.
younger somebody is when they're exposed, the tougher it is to untangle that pull. It's not impossible. But the younger one is, especially pre-puberty, it's really difficult. I know for my kids, like I've like harped on them, what you see, you can't unsee. What you see, you can't
Mhm.
unsee. Like letting them know like, hey, don't look at things that people say, hey, look at this on their phone. Like, because it's a matter of when, not if they'll see pornography.
Yeah.
I know my son in the 8th grade was like, I think I'm the only person in my middle school that's never seen pornography.
Wow.
So he
And
even recognized that it's something that's like very prevalent, that lots of people see. And like, I'm grateful that he's made that decision for himself. But what are the stats, Sam, as far as like kids exposure and like how many kids are getting exposed and what that leads in terms of like likelihood to having the addiction?
yeah, so I cover a lot of this in my new book, The Healing Church, What Churches Get Wrong About Pornography and How to Fix It. And so it is written to pastors and ministry leaders. But I think I have found that a lot of people are sending me notes and saying, oh, I didn't understand. I never really saw it this way
That
and
way.
understood it this
Yeah.
way, And so uh, I do cover a full chapter in there, not only about from the neurological perspective, how
Mm-hmm.
impactful pornography is for children, but also how do we equip families to address this and help protect their kids. And it is one thing for a child to see pornography. It is another thing for it to go on in secret. So the
Yep.
three things we talked about before was early exposure, the
Mm-hmm.
repetition, the ongoing use of pornography,
Mm-hmm.
and the um, and often some drama or trauma is like that's typically
Mm-hmm.
the three things you always see in men and women's life who are say they having an ongoing struggle with
Mm-hmm.
pornography.
The early exposure, the repetition, and some sort of trauma that's happening in the home or with the child.
That's right, and
Yeah.
every home
Yeah.
has one of these,
All of
right?
us encounter some kind of trauma in our
Right, and
childhood.
sometimes maybe that's happening at school or other things. It's there's a lot that can go on there, and it just there can be a trigger that flips between curiosity and the repetition goes along with it, creating those neural pathways in the brain, and then the trauma just kind of helps create an escapism use
Yeah.
of pornography too. All right, so we want to talk about kids
Yeah.
and parents, and so I walk parents through understanding that 93% of boys, 63% of girls are going to be exposed to pornography. So it's more of not if, but when.
Mm-hmm.
And then what can you do as a parent to help uh, prepare them for the day they do see pornography? So a book I highly recommend all the time. I don't get anything for saying this. Is a book called Good Pictures, Bad Pictures,
Mm.
and Good Pictures, Bad Pictures Junior. And the junior version is for kids 5 to 8. And believe it or not, this sometimes I've heard it over and over from parents that this becomes like a fun book to read at night, before they
Mm-hmm.
go to bed. And it is a read along book, and it shows that kids are playing and pictures of dogs and cats and their family, and it helps parents helps a child say these are good pictures and these are bad pictures. And so it shows them at the family at the beach, and they have their bathing suits covered. So very
Mm-hmm.
simplistically, it helps them understand where their bathing suit area
Mm-hmm.
is, how to identify that area, and if they see images where that's not covered, those that could be pornography.
Mm.
And and often we worry about saying words because then it will make them curious. But what I have found, and what every researcher I've talked to has found, is that when we know good information never equips a child to be more curious about pornography.
That's right.
It is when we're being vague and when they're
Mm-hmm.
learning about it from their friends, that is when uh, kids are more likely to be curious, when they're not receiving good information. So again,
Be Google for your kids. Don't let Google be Google, you know?
that's right. So it helps you teach your child to turn, run, and tell.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I had a mom come running to me at a conference where I had spoken the year before, and she came running up to our booth at Covenant Eyes and said, "Listen, hey, I just had to wait. I have got to back this up because this is so funny. I heard this, Sam, of like across this conference hall, and she comes looking at it, and I thought, I'm either in trouble or she's got some really good news. And she said, hey, I did exactly what you told me to do. We began using protective software for our devices in our homes. We made restrictions for our homes about who could have a smartphone, things like that. Used the Good Pictures, Bad Pictures book. And my 7-year-old son was just exposed to pornography. But she's excited about it. And she goes, well, he was at my neighbor's house, and that 7-year-old boy had just received an iPad for his birthday. And very quickly, he found pornography on his own. And so he flips this device around, puts it in the other 7-year-old's face and says, look what I found. And the 7-year-old who is trained, he goes, no, puts his hand up like he's trained in the book. That's pornography. And he turns, he runs, and he tells mom and dad what happened. Now, the parents let the neighbors know what happened, and those parents are like flabbergasted their child would ever be curious, like most children are curious. And with a little more investigation, they find out their 7-year-old son has been exposing children throughout the neighborhood to pornography from 7 to 11 years old. The only child who said anything was the child who had been trained. All the other children kept it their secret, whether they were scared, shocked, ashamed, fearful that they might get in trouble, or maybe there's a little secret they want to see more. So we need to equip our children to do this well. I actually show in the book how the church should be doing this for their parents in the church and how they can do that.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit more about that, because I know in the book you say that 2/3 of men and 1/3 of women who regularly attend church struggle with pornography, but only 7% of churches offer specific resources and support for their congregation. So there's a real discrepancy between what's happening outside the church walls and then what's happening inside the church walls to support what people are needing.
Yeah. And, I think we've left this topic, even in our modern culture, of being just a little too taboo to talk about. We're also under this maybe impression that it is only men who struggle, and that there are some very specific things, and if they're warned enough, they will just stop.
Right.
And so the warnings don't help very much, because I've never met a guy who's attending church. He goes, I think I would just wanted to tell my pastor today how I was struggling with pornography because he warned me about it. Instead, often there is a sinking place of shame, and people don't feel safe, and so they don't talk about what they're struggling with, especially because it's so shameful when it comes to pornography.
It's a hiding thing predominantly, right? I mean, you're first exposed in a hiding place, and it is a hiding act, and it just seems to be one of those things that I think are just so hidden that people are, I think they just want to disassociate it as much as they can from the light of day. I just wonder how much denial is happening. And then if the church isn't talking about it openly, there's really not that connection of like, okay, this is a safe place. I do need to talk about it. If I talk about it, I'm going to be accepted, because there's oftentimes just even more shame that comes out when people do disclose they're dealing with pornography.
Yeah. It's fear of rejection.
Yeah.
And there's a performance, sometimes mentality in the church. And really what always defeats shame and secrecy is being open and honest with someone who is safe.
Right.
And so when I talk about having a healing church, I always talk about having a safe place with a safe process to help people understand how to find freedom from pornography. Many listeners right now are saying, as many times as I've tried to stop viewing pornography, I haven't been successful. And so we always come back to the same solution. If I try a little harder if I work a little more, if I'm a little more determined, if I use my willpower a little bit more, if I pray more, read my scripture more, then I'm going to find freedom from this.
Right.
And the problem with that is that we stay as sick as our secrets. And within a healing community, with healing relationships, we can be honest about why we're struggling, when we're struggling, and how we're struggling. And so when we are open about those, shame knows you're powerful when you're no longer in darkness and in hiding.
That's
And
right.
so we break the secrecy. That's where we begin finding help and support. Now, at covenanteyes.com, we provide a lot of great resources. One of them is called the Victory app by Covenant Eyes. It's a free app. You download it. There's more than almost 30 courses in there, and they're all free. And you can use those resources to begin understanding, how did I get here? Why do I seem to stay stuck? And how can I begin finding freedom from pornography? Because likely you're using pornography to manage your mood.
Yeah.
You are often triggered by what I call C triggers, SEEC. You remember that? They're social, environmental, and emotional triggers. And so when we begin understanding, why do we do what we're doing, and how can we react differently to those triggers, then we'd make a lot of progress toward finding real freedom and healing, right? So it's not just hope that we can get free. There's really healing that can take
Tangible
place.
tools. I love that. So
Yes.
SEE, social, environmental, emotional. When we can identify those triggers, we often can't change the triggers, but we can begin to have better tools to engage with those triggers. And I know that's one of the things that's so frustrating with addiction in general, is that a lot of us like want to change that addictive behavior, and we've tried and we failed, and we've tried and we failed. And what would you say to the person, Sam, that's tried and failed a lot of times and just is feeling like, maybe I can't do this? And I would love for you to talk to them even too, like about like neuroplasticity and how the brain can change. And like what comes to mind? Because I know you can go in so many different
Well,
areas.
this is, I wrote a book about it, right? There's a
Yeah.
lot here. So, first of all, we have to understand that we've created a cage of our own making. We built it block by block and bar by bar, and we have locked the key, the door with the key, and we throw away the key. Nobody keeps the key. And until we're open and honest and stop living in secrecy and hiding, then we can have someone else bring us the key and help walk us out. A safe place and a safe process allows you to be held in place long enough for Christ to begin doing his healing work in our lives.
Yeah.
And so, left to my own devices, I would stay in the little jail cell because it's familiar. I'm used to it, even though I hate it, right? And so I could look in my current pattern of life and say, I'm going to do better. I'm going to be stronger. I'm going to quit. But left to my own devices, I sit inside my cell and I go around in circles and I try harder until the right trigger happens, the right mood hits me, and I go back to what I'm familiar with. But with help and support with the safe process, then you learn to take one step at a time, one day at a time, and go on a better understanding of how we're created. And the beautiful thing about this is our brains. You talked about plasticity. It used to be thought that our brains were more ceramic, that we got a certain age and that's just the way you are. You'll never really
You can't
change.
change it.
You can't teach an old dog new tricks, right? And so instead, what neurology has taught us is that our brains are more plastic than they are ceramic.
Yeah.
And they can change throughout your lifetime, even into old age. And with repeated behavior, with repeated action, you can learn and grow. And as you develop healthy habits, the old bad habits begin to go away. So it is, you'll probably think of this. I'm trying to think of the phrase that often hits this: use it or lose it.
Yeah.
That's the neuroplastic phrase.
Mm-hmm.
The more you do something, the easier it becomes. The
Mm-hmm.
less you do something else, the more distant it becomes from you. You may have tried to do something for the first time and it was very hard, but you did it a few times and it became easier and easier.
Mm-hmm.
Well, with pornography, that is backed by a lot of neurochemistry that is reinforcing, and there's neurochemical rewards and excitement and all this thing that really focuses you to create those neural pathways faster.
And
So,
strong. It's a very strong bond too from the
and
very
very
beginning.
right. And so you're going to have, it does take work to, and community to stay on a path toward healthy habits so you can begin leaving the old habits behind.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I can tell you from my experience that freedom is a real thing,
Mm-hmm.
that you don't have to live in that bondage to be stuck in pornography. And I say that with a note of caution that I protect what is in my life. It's not like, oh, yeah, Sam, you're just perfect and everything's going just fine for you. Every Thursday night, I'm still meeting with guys. We're still reading books. We're
Yeah.
checking in. I have allies that looking over
Mm-hmm.
my shoulder. They receive a report of how I use my devices, but I get
Mm-hmm.
to live in that freedom. And the freedom is real and it feels good.
Mm-hmm.
I want you to know that freedom is real.
Mm-hmm.
And let me see if I can paint a picture of, for some of your folks that might be thinking, well, I don't know why I find myself using pornography sometimes. I'm just
Yeah.
confused by it. One of my triggers for using pornography had been coiling a rope or an extension cord.
Mm.
And you'd go, well, that's just nuts. Why would that have any impact on you all? But let's go back to when I was 12 and I was helping my dad, and there had been a hemp rope that had been in the back of a pickup truck, and it got rain. And in Florida, it rains and sunshines every day, so it gets
Mm-hmm.
soaking wet, and then it gets baked in the heat.
Mm-hmm.
And this rope had then been thrown into this shed, and my dad said, "Hey, Sam, a rope." Coil up that rope. And so I began doing it like I had always done it at 12. I went around my elbow and I'm coiling up the rope. And he says, no, 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 no. I want you to do it hand over hand, hand over hand.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd never done that before. And this messed up hemp rope that had been baked in the sun after being soaked by rain would twist and turn. And every time that rope would twist or turn, my dad would hit me in the face and the head and the back, and I would panic and I began going about my elbow again, and I was in a no-win situation.
Right.
And so as an adult, I would coil an extension cord or a rope, and I wouldn't just think about that time. I would relive it. I would go back in time and relive it.
You were triggered.
And so being triggered there, now I didn't like, oh, I'm going to go run to pornography. That's not how it worked, right? My mood would change, and maybe that mood would have an impact on my children or my wife or my friends or others, right? My mood would change and I would try to stuff it, shove it down, forget it. Don't let it enter my life, rather than sharing that memory with a group of guys as I learned to later, and help as we process that and begin changing my perspective on that. Because I couldn't stop coiling extension cords or ropes, but I could change recognize that that's a trigger. I'm no longer 12. No longer have to go back in time. I don't have to feel the way that I felt. And so I would coil a rope and I would often sing to myself. And it
Mm,
would be something like, how deep the Father's love for us. And so I'd coil that rope
mhm.
and I would not have to find myself triggered later that day. Now, that sounds like a very simple thing. But what I found is that in a community, in a safe place with a safe process, I got to understand why do I do and feel what I feel, and how can I release that rather than carrying it and allowing that trigger for me that day. Now, again, it wasn't like, oh, Sam curled a rope and he off to watch pornography. It would be like
Right.
later that night or later that,
Yeah.
some other day, or, it would be that stress reliever, that emotional reliever to regulate the mood.
Mhm.
And what I'm saying is, you don't have to live
Mhm.
in that kind of jail. And
Yeah.
often we don't recognize that. But when we have close relationships, when we have allies that are going to walk with us, then we can really unpack and understand, why am I being tempted right now? It allows us to be curious. Why am I being so tempted by pornography right now? And what can I do instead? That's how we learn to live in freedom. And the more times you do that, the more your brain changes and builds neural pathways for healthy habits instead of the bad habits.
Yeah, that's so empowering. I find that those questions and a spirit of curiosity is really one that promotes change.
Mhm.
You know, it's not just you asking yourself questions, it's also you engaging with it. Cause I find so many times when we do have that addiction, there's such a denial to it that we don't even want to engage with what's going on in our hearts or our heads. And I love the fact of just like tuning in of like, what's going on here? Because it was also a
Yeah.
feeling of powerlessness that you experienced.
Yeah.
And when we
That's exactly
empower
right.
ourselves with curiosity, it's very grounding to hear ourselves and to connect with ourselves. And I think that's one of the things that pornography does too, is it creates like a false connection, a false reality. And I
Mm,
think when we can remain grounded like you did, I think that really promotes the soil or place that change can happen. And so
mhm.
I'm with you. I definitely I wouldn't do what I do. You wouldn't do what you do if you didn't believe that change is possible. It just
Right.
unfortunately
Yes.
can take many, many times. And it takes many, many times for me to grow and to change too. And so as we kind of enter time today, I'm wondering if you could just give somebody a word of encouragement that's maybe feeling discouraged from their addiction or maybe overwhelmed of how do I talk to my kids about this? Like, where do I even begin? Because this conversation of pornography, it can make you feel a little squirmy on the inside.
Well, sometimes we have a hard time finding a safe place to talk about this. So for men, I recommend an organization that I serve with. In fact, I just hosted a newcomer meeting today, just before this call. And it's samsonsociety.com. And it's a community of Christian men who are supporting one another in something in their life that's bigger than they are. And for the vast majority of the men coming in, it is for pornography and unwanted sexual behaviors. But there's often other things as well. Another one I
Sure.
would recommend for women
Mhm.
is sherecovery.com.
Okay.
Sherecovery.com, community of Christian women who are supporting one another in finding strength and freedom there.
Very cool.
For for parents, I highly recommend um, a couple of things. Protectyoungeyes.com is a great resource that can provide lots of educational support and software tools and things like that that they review and recommend for the age of your child. Um, Access.org is another great resource for parents as well, to help them have that ongoing conversation. We want to have an ongoing conversation, not just,
Exactly. It's not just one and done.
it's not one and done. And then again, that Good Pictures, Bad Pictures,
Oh
or
yeah.
Good Pictures, Bad Pictures Junior book.
Hmm. And what was the name of that first one, Sam, that you mentioned?
The samsonsociety.com.
Uh-huh. Perfect. Where can we find you? I know you have lots of resources. You mentioned the Victory app, Covenant Eyes. You have several books. Where's a good spot for us to kind of get everything?
You can go to thehealingchurch.com as well. I'm sorry, I said to get everything. There's thehealingchurch.com, and then covenanteyes.com is the other place where you can get many more of those resources.
Well, I so appreciate all the work that you've done and helping us to find freedom. And I look forward to talking with you again because I know that you have so much to offer and lots of things to talk about.
Well, thank you so much, Melissa. Grateful to be here. This has been, it's been an invigorating conversation. Thank you.
Good. You're very welcome.